mental hospitals is also very strongly racially biased, and we also know that many of those people first come to the attention of the health services via being picked up by the police. So there's definitely a very real issue that people enter that system through the criminal justice system. And now that the threshold for collecting DNA has become so low, many of those people are ending up on the database. I should say that from the people that phone me up concerned about the database, several of them are, people who've had mental health problems and who find it particularly difficult sometimes, if they're suffering already from paranoia or other symptoms like this, to deal with the fact that the police have taken their DNA and maybe keeping it and that they don't know how it's going to be used. So the key issues I've put down in 5 categories. I think there's many different ways to divide these up. I'm not going to say much about false matches because I think Bill's going to say a lot more about that later, but we should remember that DNA evidence is not foolproof. There are a number of ways in which things can go wrong. There are these increasing use of these new techniques which have lower reliability. So the one that's been controversial in Britain in particular is low copy number DNA, which involves analysing very small amounts of DNA, a less reliable technique, and a technique that can also be applied potentially to DNA that's not come, that's been transferred from you to somebody else. So this issue of if you shake hands with a murderer, they go on to commit the crime, would your DNA be on the knife? There's issues about analysing mixed samples, which again I think Bill's going to talk about. And we have also an issue about the growth in size of the database and new plans to share DNA matches across the European Union. So there basically is now an agreement in principle to allow that to happen, and the proposal, which I think is not quite finalised but nearly, is to allow matches to be shared, or information to be shared on the basis of matches at 6 loci, which will definitely, well, the forensic scientists themselves, I know, are nervous about the potential for people being falsely implicated in crimes that have happened elsewhere in Europe. The issue of stigmatisation, I've already talked about the bias in terms of individuals on the database. I think I'll probably leave it at that. I think it's self-evident that there's potential for that to happen. And it's particularly a concern in relation also not just to the DNA itself, but in relation to the retention of the police records, because very many different public agencies can get access to information from the police national computer, and certainly for employment checks that can happen. So there's real potential for people even to be refused jobs or to be refused visas as a result of records of arrest. And that links with my point there about surveillance. I don't think we've talked enough today about how governments might use these databases for surveillance. And I think if you were living in China or Zimbabwe or somewhere else, this issue would be, at the top of your mind. There are many people on the database now who've been arrested for protest-related offences. There are many vulnerable people who suffered from mental illness and so on. There's a strong trend towards risk prediction, predictive profiling across all government departments in Britain, not just in relation to the DNA database, but in relation to trying to predict risk. And the idea that this population is a particularly risky population that might need increased levels of surveillance or control is an idea that could become much more prevalent in the future. It's already causing a major concern with some of our proposals for children's databases in Britain, where there's a big proposal really to keep the details of every child, their school records, whether they've come into contact with social workers and so on, actually to give them a kind of risk score, which is intended to be for their own protection, but also clearly could be seriously misused. So I think we have to be concerned about surveillance. When I flew in yesterday, as the other UK people did, I had to sign one of those green forms that us foreigners have to sign. And if you read it carefully, it asks you to declare that you've never been arrested for offences, I think it's moral turpitude, whatever that may be. I just signed it anyway. But what's interesting, and of course you declare you're not a terrorist. I don't know who doesn't sign it, but anyway. But what's interesting is in the past, records of arrest are not something that the US government, for example, could have checked. Now they are. Now they could go and start to try and seek that information and say you can't come into the United States because you have a record of arrest, even if that's in relation to protests or something relatively political. So that power is starting to exist. And my final point on here is about genetic research without consent. We're not opposed to research being done that's about the database itself, checking false matches and so on, trying to improve it. But what's happening now is some of the research that you heard talked about earlier about trying to predict race and other characteristics from DNA left at a crime scene. Some of that type of research has been done using our national DNA database without any consent process or any information or any knowledge of the people on it that is being done, and that has included some research that goes back to the original samples. And linked with that, we have to remember the issue that I raised before about the fact that the laboratories are keeping the samples, they're being paid to keep the samples, they have a commercial interest potentially in doing this kind of research, and they're also being sent information that they don't necessarily need and that risks serious breaches of privacy. So my conclusions are, firstly, that people on the database are still essentially being treated as members of a risky population, and that there's been a major shift in the power of the state to implement biosurveillance on the population. I've stolen that term from one of Robin's papers, but the idea that you can be tracked, essentially, using your DNA. And so can your relatives. There's serious potential for abuse by the state. So we're all sitting here in this room. We're not committing any crimes, but if we were living in a police state, the police could come in, check who left their DNA there, and if we were on the database, try to find out who we are, who our relatives are. And there's also potential for infiltration of the system. I heard a talk a year or so ago about from a woman who was working in Italy, who was talking about concerns there that the mafia might start infiltrating the system, finding out DNA profiles and using it as a way to breach witness protection schemes. So there's certainly a potential for other individuals to go and work in the labs, try and track down people using their DNA should they try to do so. The potential for errors is increasing, and there are serious issues, as you all know, about loss of privacy, loss of the right to refuse to consent, and potentially visas and employment. Thank you.